Good morning and welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Paul Kiritsis, and today I'll be giving you a short exposition on the four elements, or the four alchemical elements. In the esoteric language, the four elements are not to be confused with the four corporeal manifestations of the same name. So they are merely the initial or primary differentiations of the primal virginal substance of all creation, the prima materia. All of them exhibit two or four secondary properties, so either hot, cold, dry, and moist. This theory came down to us through the Aristotelian doctrine of matter, though it most probably took shape under the philosophical musings of the Ionic pre-Socratic philosophers. The ethereal element of water is cold and moist, and its material manifestation as a composition of two atoms of hydrogen and one of water, so H2O, is an immediate and exoteric expression of the former's quintessential aspects. So it's a volatility, its passivity, amorphousness, colorlessness, and receptivity. Water is characterized by the condition of heaviness, but also of expansion, on a scale which orders the four ethereal elements on the basis of their pureness and level of refinement. Water would come third, after both air and fire. Unlike the latter two, which tend to rise, water is rather dense and possesses a downward tendency. Nevertheless, it's not as heavy, invariable, and sluggish as the element of earth. In alchemical manuscripts and other esoteric documents, it is symbolized by an overturned triangle. And if we look at this illustration by Johann Daniel Mylius, which is called Philosophia Reformata, which was published in 1622, we can see water here. Next we'll move on to fire. Fire is the most revered of the four ethereal elements. In ancient times, its inextricable connection to the sun rendered it of utmost importance as the source of life and all creation. In the temples of many solar deities, fire would burn unremittingly in the innermost sanctuary, or the Holy of Holies, where it symbolized the undefiled first matter, the Empyrean of God. Heraclitus of Ephesus, who lived between 535 and 475 BC, a contemporary of Anaximenes of Miletus, so he lived between 584 and 528 BC, was the first intellectual and philosopher to identify fire as the most pivotal of the differentiating elements of the original chaos, the prima materia, as well as the foremost quality defining the latter. He posited that fire was the active and only mover behind elemental rotation, that is, the transformation of the four elemental properties into one another, so earth into water, water into air, air into fire, and fire into earth again. By this virtue, it made perfect sense that the underlying cause of all phenomena, the manifestations of the noumenal world, as well as the fundamental change through chemical processes, including calcination, coagulation, distillation, sublimation, and dissolution, could be attributed to the subtle action of ethereal fire. This pre-Socratic notion infiltrated the classical world entirely, for philosophers of the likes of Pythagoras, Empedocles, Plato, and Aristotle all agreed that the primordial substance, or the receptacle of matter, was probably an intangible fire of sorts. It was theorized to be truant or threefold in nature, possessing an ethereal or celestial, a subterranean, and a terrestrial equivalent. The element exhibits the fundamental properties of hot and dry, and its material manifestation as the oxidization of a particular substance through combustion is an immediate and exoteric expression of the former's quintessential aspects, so its boundlessness, inscrutability, and its propensity to purify and generate, its ability to rise and illuminate, and its relentless activity and elasticity. In contradistinction to water, which was envisioned to be feminine in nature and connected with the color green, fire was masculine and linked with red. If the elements were ordered according to the compass of all possible movements, fire would come first. Unlike the other three first differentiations of the prima materia, which exhibits multiple tendencies, fire remained faithful to just one, which is the condition of rising. In alchemical treatises and in the realm of esotericism, it is symbolized by a triangle. And if we refer back to the diagram, fire is there. Next, we'll move on to the element of earth. The formulation of the four ethereal elements of fire, water, earth, and air is more often than not attributed to the speculative thought of Empedocles of Agragas, who lived between 492 and 432 BC. It was generally agreed amongst most pre-Socratic philosophers that the four primary differentiations were the first spawn of a basic substance known as the prima materia that had existed for time immemorial. In scrying the memory bank of philosophical conjecture, we see that the first person to identify ethereal earth as a primary element was the 6th century thinker Kiritsis of Syros. Both he and Aristotle adhered to a train of thought which placed the element at the exact center of the heavenly rotations, identifying it as the fukund from which the other three, fire, water, and air, miraculously sprung forth. In addition, it was also commonplace that everything filtering down into the physical realm would filter through the ethereal element for the conferral of form before finally materializing. Aristotle reasoned that the ethereal version of earth must be like its physical or material constituent, characterized by the conditions of heaviness, solidity, and geometrical or concrete form. Hence, it was likely that earth-laden principles and substances would be orientated by a gravitational tendency to drop towards the navel of the cosmos. Together with water, earth was considered a wholly feminine principle with a receptive and passive personality. Its two fundamental properties were cold and dry, putting it last on a provisional ladder that orders the four elements according to their subtleties, intricacies, and material fineness. Ethereal earth is esoterically and symbolically connected to potentiality, the color white, the concept of life, as well as the cardinal direction of south and the phenomena of heat and electricity. In the alchemical theory of matter and in esotericism, the element is equated with the principle of salt and symbolized by an overturned triangle bisected by a horizontal line. So earth is here, next to water. And finally, the last of our elements is air. For centuries, people in the ancient world believed that water could be transmuted into air through fire. We can probably safely attribute this to the fundamental properties attributed to the ethereal element by the classical philosophers. Air is hot and wet, linking it to both fire and water on the wheel of elemental rotation, where the underlying theory of shared characteristics explains why one element can transmute into another. Anaximenes of Miletus, so he lived about mid-16th century BC, was the first pre-Socratic philosopher to attach a special significance to air, naming it as the element of which the primary chaos and empyrean of God was composed. This conviction was inherited by esoteric and practical alchemy in late antiquity and immortalized in an 8th century Arabic text by Jabir Hayyan, which would become known and popularized as the Emerald Tablet, which says of the philosopher's stone, "The wind carried it in its womb." Hence the element was so important in esoteric thought that it was even imagined to be the womb which brought forth the elusive and transcendental stone itself. Alchemy's veneration of the element is completely logical, given that the pre-Socratic philosophers, including the likes of Anaximenes of Miletus and Diogenes Apolloniates, so he lived in the late 15th century BC, whom influenced ideas pertaining to the first differentiation of matter, were initially convinced that ethereal air was the very fabric holding the tapestry of woven threads of created nature together. Air is an active, masculine element, and its two fundamental properties are hot and moist, or wet. Just like its material counterpart, the element is inextricably associated with volatility, expansion, and becoming, but also with the condition of death and sleep, the cardinal direction of north, the color black, and the quality of falsehood. If the four elements were ordered according to the compass of all possible movements, it would come second, after fire. Its primary tendency is to rise and extend. In all esoteric currents, including chemical operative and spiritual philosophical alchemy, air is symbolized by a triangle bisected by a horizontal line. So air is there. And that's our 4 elements. That concludes today's lesson, and I will see you next time for more. Have a good one.